How many of you have ever changed a tire? Have you ever changed a tire? All right. Some of you have, well, most of you have. How many of you enjoyed that? You know, Danny, you're one of the weird ones here. So, no. I took Heather out not too long ago, I don't know, it was a while ago, and said, all right, come on out. We're going to show you how to change this tire. And she's never had to do it yet. But hopefully she can remember something. Changing the tire is one of those things that comes up and you have to do it. How many of you ever changed jobs and had to learn something new in your job? Yeah, that can be interesting. That can be a good time. It could also be a not so good time if you're not quite getting it. How many of you ever changed location from one state to another? A lot of you here would fall into that category. That takes adjustment. I know when I moved down here, one of those things I never anticipated was not being able to see what stores were back in the malls, you know. All the landscaping they had, I had to come to memorize what store was in what section so I could turn into the right place, you know. Change on all different levels affects us differently, and sometimes we want to change, sometimes we have to change, sometimes we are excited about change. But I want you to think about change on the spiritual level today. Because so many times we don't even think about that. We just think that it's all just going to just naturally flow, and we're going to go from one level to the next, to the next, to the next, and we're going to end up there eventually someday. We don't really think much about it. But today I want us to think about that and see how God uses things and events and people in our lives to help us to grow, to help us to change. Because if we're honest with ourselves, there's probably a step or two that we could go on beyond where we're at in our walk with Christ. So as we've been going through the book of Acts, we continue our journey. Today we're going to look at Acts, just a small section in Acts chapter 8 and chapter 9. But I ended last week with chapter 5 when the persecution of the church began. Now I'm just going to summarize Acts chapter 6 and 7. In Acts chapter 6, a problem arose in the church. We know that never happens today, but it did back then, all right? And what was happening, they were feeding the widows in the church. And some of the Greek widows said, hey, the Jewish ladies are getting more food than us. And they went to the apostles. And the apostles said, you know, we recognize this is an issue, but we need to spend time reading the word and preaching the word and praying for the church. Why don't you select among yourselves some leaders and let them take care of the issues that are at hand? And that's exactly what they did. They chose 7 men full of faith and wisdom. 2 of those men became evangelists in the church. And in the rest of chapter 6, there's a guy by the name of Stephen who starts preaching and teaching, and he's doing miracles and wonders, and it calls the attention to the Jewish leaders, and they drag him in and said, what are you doing? And then in Acts chapter 7, he gives the defense of his ministry. It's a great history of how God has acted throughout history. I encourage you to read chapter 6 and 7. It didn't end so well for Stephen, though, because at the end of chapter 7, he's stoned to death. When the heavens opened up and he declared he saw the Son of God sitting at the right hand of God. And they rushed in and they stoned him to death. Then in Acts chapter 8, we're going to look at a passage that says a persecution broke out. But then another man stepped up, another one of those leaders that were selected by the name of Philip. And Philip was used by God. God told him to go talk to this guy that's in a chariot going down the road. And he goes up to him, and he's from Ethiopia. He's in the administration of the queen. And he shares with him Jesus as the man was reading the Bible, and Philip baptized the Ethiopian there that day. And that kind of brings us up to speed to Acts chapter 9. What we find in Acts chapter 9 is an encounter with Jesus. And it happens in 3 different situations with 3 different people. And you can look at this, many times people look at Acts chapter 9 as Paul or Saul being the main character. But today, I want to look at it just a little bit different, because there's actually 3 characters in this chapter, but they're all centered around what happens when Jesus is in your life. You see, the first one is very reluctant. In fact, is opposed to following Jesus. And he is resistant to hearing the word and doing what might be the right thing to do, he's very resistant. And then the second one comes along and he's a Christian, but he's hesitant. God tells him to do something and he just kind of, I'm not sure, I don't know. And the third is sold out and he lives like Jesus. And my guess is that here this morning, there's people on all three levels. There's some that may be resistant to God. And the only reason you're here is because someone dragged you into it or guilted you into it or tricked you or what. How did I end up here? I don't know. And then maybe there's some of us who are just a little bit, we're followers of Jesus, but we're a little bit hesitant. When he knows he wants us to do something and we just have to really struggle with, oh man, I'm not sure if that's something I want to do or not. And then could there be some of us that are sold out to Christ and yet still can even take the next step? So let's look at those three things. And the first thing I want to look at is that first character, and on the back of your bulletin, there's actually an outline today with some questions and things like that. If you like filling out the outlines, here's the first one. Change happens when we see Jesus. Change happens when we see Jesus. I want to read a verse in Acts chapter 8 to kind of set the scene. It says this in Acts chapter 8, verse 1, says, on that day, on what day? On that day, this is a continuation of the day Stephen was stoned to death, all right? So chapter 8 begins, on that day, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem. And all except the apostles scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Stephen was stoned, and then a persecution broke out, and the church scattered. Actually, that was a fulfillment of what Jesus said in Acts chapter 1 when he told the disciples, I want you to go to Jerusalem and then Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. Acts chapter 8 is a fulfillment of Acts chapter 1. God acts in history. Man responds to God. So that's what happens. And the church is beginning to feel persecution. And the one that is the head of it all is Saul. Now, Saul's name is changed to Paul later on, all right? So if I interchange those two today, just forgive me. Just think, oh, he's getting old. I understand, all right? Gets those things mixed up, all right? But Saul, at this point, at the end of chapter 7, at the beginning of chapter 8, was a pretty self-righteous guy. In fact, Paul describes himself like this in the book of Philippians when he's looking back on his life. He says, if anyone else thinks he has reasons to put confidence in the flesh, I have more. He's kind of puffing out his chest here, saying, wait till you listen to my credentials. It says, circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin. That was kind of the premier tribe. Of the people of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. Said, I am purebred Hebrew from day one. In regard to the law, a Pharisee. As for zeal, that means enthusiasm, persecuting the church. As for legalistic righteousness, now listen to this. As for legalistic righteousness, faultless. Did Paul have an ego problem? Well, it depends how you look at it. He had a real ego problem or he had a real good self-esteem. I'm not sure, but that's who is encountering and persecuting the church. Well, in Acts chapter 9, things begin to change. Because in Acts chapter 9, verses 1 through 9, this is what happens. I like the way Luke, he's a good writer. Because his first word in Acts chapter 9 is, meanwhile, it's kind of like, meanwhile, back at the ranch. Because in Acts chapter 8, persecution broke out. Then that story of Philip baptizing the Ethiopian. And then it comes back in chapter 9. It says, meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogue in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, that means Christians, that's what they were called early on, the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. Now, this wasn't just next door to Jerusalem. Damascus is about 135 miles north of Jerusalem. It's pretty much the northern part of the land of Palestine. So Paul was going out through the known region looking for Christians, went all the way up to Damascus. He wanted to make sure he covered the entire area. Verse 3, as he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? Saul asked. I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. He replied, now get up and go to the city, and you will be told what you must do. At that moment, Saul was blinded. He couldn't see. He had traveling companions with him. They heard the noise. They knew something had happened, but they weren't quite sure. And Saul gets up and starts stumbling around. And they take him into Damascus, and the verses following tell us what happened. For 3 days he stayed in Damascus, and he didn't eat, he didn't drink. He just had to be in a state of shock. You can imagine. You're blinded. The last thing you remember seeing is Jesus saying, why are you persecuting me? And Jesus goes on to tell him that, Saul, you're going to see what I have in store for you. So all of a sudden, in Paul's life, all of those qualifications, I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews. As far as righteousness goes, I am faultless. All of a sudden, none of that made a bit of difference. Because now he was a broken man, blind and weak. And his life was about to change. What would seeing Jesus do to you? You know, it probably won't happen like it happened to Saul. But I've known people, and there's been times in my life where you just feel that, boom, something happens. And all of a sudden gets your attention. It's interesting to note that Saul was not seeking Jesus, was he? He was just walking down the road. He was couldn't wait till he got to Damascus so he could find the next set of Christians that he could drag out, throw into prison, and all of a sudden, boom. Sometimes things like that happen in life that just take us totally off guard. Sometimes our lives, we're shocked into reality that we're not in control of everything. Maybe it's a death of a loved one. Maybe it's a death of a friend. Maybe it's a crisis that happens in your life, a crisis in relationship, a crisis in job. There might be all kinds of different things that all of a sudden we realize that we are not the ones in charge here. And that certainly happened in Saul's life on that road. And I guess what I want us to reflect on and think about as Saul encountered Jesus, even though he said he knew God, I'm a Pharisee, I'm righteous, better than anyone else. He had never seen Jesus for who he was. And if our lives are going to grow, if we're going to go from skepticism to faith, sometimes we have to admit that we're not in charge and we're not in control and we don't understand everything goes on. But Lord, I will put my faith in you one step at a time. So Saul found out that his life was changed when for the very first time he actually saw who Jesus was. Well, the story goes on. In verses 10 through 12, God appears to a man in Damascus, and his name is Ananias. And from Ananias, we come to find out that change happens next when we obey Jesus. Change happens when we obey Jesus. You see, what happened is God came to Ananias and said, Ananias, there's this guy coming to town, and his name is Saul. And I have a little favor to ask of you. I just want you to go and meet Saul and take care of him. Now, Ananias responded like many of us would at that point. He said, what? Said, Lord, I have heard that this guy has come to town to kill Christians. And you want me to go to his house? You've got to be kidding me. That was my addition to the text there. But that's what he was thinking. He wasn't quite sure that he really wanted to obey what God asked him to do. Verse 13, the action picks up there. Lord, Ananias answered, I've heard many reports about this man and all the harm he has done to your saints in Jerusalem, and he has come here with authority from the chief priests to arrest all who call on your name. But the Lord said to Ananias, go. This man is my chosen instrument to carry my name before the Gentiles and the kings and before all the people of Israel. I will show him how much he must suffer for my name. And then Ananias went to the house and entered it. And the verses following that tell the story. He walks in, he meets Saul there. And he goes over to him and he lays his hands on Saul. And it says that scales fell from his eyes. And he began to see. And then they gave him some food and he began to eat. And he regained his strength. And then he was baptized into the Lord. And then he regained his strength and went out and began to preach in the synagogues. Not looking for Christians, but it says he convinced them with many convincing proofs that Jesus was indeed the Son of God. Well, that got him into trouble with the Jews because they didn't like that message anyway. And they plotted to kill him. And Ananias helped Paul escape at night through a window in the wall of Damascus. And Saul left town. Now in that episode, in that encounter, there are two people that actually obeyed. One was Ananias. Even though he's reluctant. Do you think he was scared when he knocked on the door at Saul's house? I think so. He's probably thinking, all right, I'm going to knock real light. Maybe he won't hear. And then I can say, I did what I'm out of here now. I don't know. But he went, and when the door opened, God gave them boldness to do what he needed to do. The second one that obeyed was Paul, Saul. It says he regained his strength, he got up, he was baptized, and then he began to teach. What does it take to obey? What does it mean to obey? How do you know sometimes even what it is God wants you to do? That's a fair question. Paul and Ananias both experienced what it meant. For us, it may mean different things. It may mean obeying means simply being, as our mission statement, the hands, feet, and heart of Jesus. If someone comes into your path that needs help. Ananias provided that. It may mean aligning yourself with God's will or God's plans or God's path rather than your own. How do you do that on a very practical basis? That's a tough question. Well, how do I know that God wants me to do this? One thing I've tried to follow in my life, and I'm not saying I got it all figured out because, I've made plenty of mistakes along the way, but I try to what I call follow an open door policy. When you're really seeking something and really praying about something, see if God opens any doors or see if He closes any doors. And if He opens the door, go through that door. If He closes the door, don't try to bash it through. When we align ourselves with God's plan, that helps us grow. And it helps us just take that next step. We don't know what happened to Ananias after this, other than he became brave enough probably to help Paul escape. But I'm sure it was a step of faith for him. So if we want to change, we need to learn to obey. It means that Paul, he had to submit to God's will. He had to submit and realize and understand that God had something different for him. Talk about a 180-degree change. On the way to Damascus, he's looking to kill Christians. As he's leaving Damascus, there's people looking to kill him because he's a follower of Jesus. That was quite a change. And it all came about because of obedience with an encounter with Jesus. Well, Paul goes down to Jerusalem from Damascus. And there's another encounter with a third character. Verse 26. Change happens when we live like Jesus. Listen to what happens here. When he came to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples. But they were all afraid of him, not believing that he was really a disciple. Did you catch that? He tried to join the disciples. Why did they not accept him? Well, it's not like it was on the evening news. Saul encounters Jesus on the road to Damascus. Life change. No one texted him. No one emailed him. No one let him know that his life had changed. So he goes to the disciples. In his mind, well, they'll love hearing this story. And they're very, very, oh, no way. Verse 27. But Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles. He told them how Saul on his journey had seen the Lord, and that the Lord had spoken to him, and how Damascus he had preached fearlessly in the name of Jesus. So Saul stayed with them and moved about freely in Jerusalem, speaking boldly in the name of the Lord. And he talked and he debated with the Grecian Jews, but they tried to kill him. Some of the Jews were still against him. And when the brothers learned of this, they took him down to Caesarea and sent him off to Tarsus. Here's Saul. He gets rejected by the Christians that are there. Barnabas steps up and literally becomes the hands, feet, and heart of Jesus to the man who had no one that stood up for him at all. And Barnabas was that one. Barnabas was the one that said, you know what? I'm going to take him to the apostles. And he told them their story. And they accepted him. And it sounds like Paul went back out and started teaching again. And then some of the Jews got upset again and was after him again. And they sent him off one more time. So what does it look like to live like Jesus? It might look a little bit like Barnabas when no one else was willing to do what needed to be done. Barnabas stepped up and did it. And I'd encourage us all, try to get to that level and then even go beyond. Because Barnabas, it's not the last you're going to hear about him here. He takes another step after this. I'm not going to tell you what that is. You'll have to come back and find out, all right? But he continued to grow in his faith. And my challenge is simply this, that we all might learn. You see, there's one central character in all of this, and that's Jesus. And it was dependent on how they looked at Jesus. That's what made a difference in how they responded to him. So today, we're going to do something a little bit different than the sermon. I want us to just think about what it'd be like to turn our eyes on Jesus. We're going to lower all the lights, except for one. And I want you to just listen to the words of this and let God speak to your heart. And maybe this is the day that is the day that you will change by turning your eyes to him.